All right, so we have all of this resistance occurring, right? And this leads us to the Boston Massacre, which takes place in 1770. So obviously this takes place in Boston. In Boston at the time, there are about 15,000 colonists, and there are about 4,000 troops stationed there. So a pretty high percentage of the population are troops that are supposed to be monitoring the rebellious people of Boston. And these troops are loathed, so it's this constant reminder of their oppression. On top of that, the troops oftentimes work off duty as laborers, and they would work for cheaper pay than the colonists would. So they often took a lot of jobs that the colonists might be able to get. So fights were common between the troops and the colonists. Verbal fights, sometimes small skirmishes. In the night in question, there were 10 British troops guarding the courthouse, and a crowd had gathered to heckle them, which was not uncommon. People started throwing snowballs, they were, shouting insults. Eventually, people got a little handsy. Their fight broke out, and the troops fired. They hit 11 people, and 5 of those people were killed. So yes, you only need 5 people to die for it to be a massacre, apparently. Samuel Adams seized this opportunity, calling it an atrocity, calling it a massacre, and this news spread throughout the colonies and the papers. So this is a famous artwork that you probably have seen before of the Boston Massacre, and made it clear to Parliament that the Townshend duties were causing more harm than good, because everyone in the colonies was getting upset over this, not just people in Boston. And so Townshend's successor repealed all duties but the one on tea. So they got rid of all of the taxes that were part of the Townshend Acts, but tea. Tea kept its special tax. And this calmed things for a while, calmed the resistance a little bit because of those items being repealed. But there were still problems. So colonists were still paying taxes on molasses and tea that they did not want to be paying. They were still subject to trials in admiralty courts, which they did not agree with because they liked their juries. And they were still living with a standing army. So really they just needed one last straw to sort of set things off. And this GASPEE incident would kind of prove to be that last straw. This took place in Rhode Island. So the GASPEE was a British ship, and it was chasing some smugglers around the area of Rhode Island. And so the GASPEE ends up running aground in this chase and gets stuck. And the residents of Providence, Rhode Island, go to the water line near where the vessel is stuck in the mud, in the muck, and the sand. And instead of assisting, they go out there and torch the GASPEE. And there's this GASPEE commission sent to investigate from England. And this really upset the colonists because they had their own investigative committee, and they thought that England was overstepping its bounds, so they didn't need to be investigating. So, if you watch sort of like cop dramas and, the local police department is handling a case and then the FBI swoops in and takes control, it's kind of like that. So the colonists were bent out of shape that England was stepping in, and this sort of reignited the resistance. And that same year, so just shortly around the time after the GASPEE incident, we have the committees of correspondence that are formed. And this was a political strategy devised by Samuel Adams, trying to get the colonies on the same page, to sort of rally support against England. So they were set up in all colonies by their assemblies, and they started drawing up what American rights they thought they had, what their grievances were with England, and they started distributing them amongst each other, soliciting feedback, sort of getting them in the local papers so that colonists were aware of what was going on, not just these founding father types. And so they really formed a communication network this way, really for the first time. The colonies were all getting on the same page, and there was a lot of success. So even in rural areas, this information was spreading. Okay, so the following year, 1773, we have the Tea Act. You probably know what's coming shortly after the Tea Act. You can probably guess. The Tea Act was a bailout. The East India Company had gone bankrupt. They were a rather corrupt company, and so England granted them a monopoly on the tea trade in the Americas. No other company would have access to selling tea there. And so they would, the East India Company sent their own agents out to sell tea directly to consumers, so cutting out the middleman, so merchants weren't going to be involved here. And this it did give the consumers a lower cost of the tea, but it was hurting merchants, and merchants were the wealthy white dudes who were really controlling everything. And even still, Americans saw it as a trick. Sort of England just overreaching, catering to the general population by lowering tea, but really they're just saving the East India Company. So in 1773, all colonial leaders started calling for tea cargo to immediately be returned to England. So it would come to the docks and they'd be like, nope, no tea, send it back. This brings us here. Boston Tea Party, 1773. So what happened here, thousands of Bostonians and farmers from people outside of Boston all gathered at the Old South Meeting House to try and discuss how they were going to properly deal with this tea situation. And most people who were attending did not know what the ultimate plan was for that evening. Samuel Adams led this huge group of people through the streets, whooping and hollering and protesting and causing all sorts of commotion. And then 50 men of the group had dressed up as Native Americans, kind of to protect their identity. And they boarded these 3 vessels that were carrying a ton of tea, and they dumped it all in the wharf, or in the harbor. So this was actually 90,000 pounds of tea, which was worth 10,000 pounds silver. And they dumped it into Boston Harbor. As you may be aware, there were severe repercussions from the Boston Tea Party. And this is one of your readings to read the Intolerable Acts. And these acts were passed in 1774, the following year after the Boston Tea Party. Tea Party took place in December, so they were pretty swift in implementing these acts. So let's get through these acts. One thing I do want to say, we have the Intolerable Acts and we have the Coercive Acts. So they're kind of 2 different things. The Coercive Acts are the first 4, and they are direct punishments for the Boston Tea Party. The 5th one, the Quebec Act, was added on shortly after those 4, and Americans lumped all 5 together, calling them the Intolerable Acts. So if you see Coercive Acts, that means these first 4. If you see Intolerable, that's all 5. We're going to go through all 5 right now. Boston Port Act, 1774. It closed the port of Boston until Boston paid back all the damages from the destroyed tea. So, clear punishment for Boston. Massachusetts Government Act, also 1774. It altered the way the government worked in Boston. So the provincial council was no longer elected. They would be crown appointed, so hand selected by the crown. Other officials would be selected and dismissed by a royal governor. So again, in control by England. Jury system would be altered. So the juries would now be chosen by the sheriff, who was a crown appointed official. And town meetings would be restricted. So they needed to get permission in order to hold one. And as you recall from talking about Puritans, people in New England were very much dependent on their town meetings. Next up, the Administration of Justice Act, also 1774. This meant that the governor could move trials from Massachusetts to another colony or to Great Britain. And this was said that it was done in order to make sure people received a fair trial. But what that really meant is that if people were going to trial for something where they may have gotten access to a jury, the governor could move that trial so that the ruling would be more in favor of England and not the colonies. So that was very upsetting, of course. And the Quartering Act gave troops more power to take over private homes or taverns, etc., for quartering. So this is the second Quartering Act. We talked about that first one. This one meant that people could start being housed in homes or private property if the commander deemed it appropriate. Okay, so those first four, again, those are the coercive acts, and these are clear punishment on the colonies, right? Mainly Massachusetts. Now we have the Quebec Act, and adding this fifth one to the mix makes them intolerable. The Quebec Act, there was this old plan that was in place for how to deal with the new British Canadian lands, and before these lands would be given an elected legislature, but now they're going to have a governor and an appointed council. So a council is no longer going to be elected but appointed by the crown. They are going to continue to use French law, and also they acknowledged and legitimized the Catholic Church as the dominant church for Canada. So all these things are offensive to Protestant, Anglican, heavily colonists in North America. For one, using French law, that's not British and that's not American. Using the Catholic Church, that's certainly not favorable for most people. And so this was just kind of seen as like, oh, they're just unnecessarily showing power in Canada when they don't need to. Really, the colonists thought it was quite stubborn. But England would argue that they were trying to make life easier for people of Canada, letting them continue to use French law, letting them continue to have the Catholic Church, etc. So, little bit of a discrepancy there. People really start getting upset after these intolerable acts. So people are talking about historical patterns, they're studying history and talking about the downfall of empires and how that compares to what's going on now, and they're noticing a pattern. The pattern consists of costly wars. Of course, we have a costly war here, the 7 Years' War, which the colonies are now paying for, and that is those oppressive taxes that is part of this pattern. We see standing armies, which they would argue, especially in Boston, they've got a standing army, and corrupt officials. So all these crown-appointed officials that are being sent in, and they're saying that this empire is about to fall, this British Empire. And this might be the time to seize the moment. And people start talking about being Americans and no longer being British, and got to stop drinking tea and wearing fancy British clothing, etc. So we have a real turning point after these intolerable acts. So in 1774, we have the First Continental Congress, where everyone is feeling chaotic. There's a sort of difference in opinion. So we've got Massachusetts, and things are very chaotic in Massachusetts. They're on the verge of anarchy. But we've got other colonies that aren't quite sure, how they feel. All colonies sent representatives, except Georgia sent a delegate. Diversity. So again, difference in how rebellious people were feeling, right? There were values that almost everyone had at this meeting. So feeling like they valued industry and self-reliance and the common good, and everybody mistrusted England. There were some misgivings. People weren't sure how to proceed. Massachusetts in particular, and Sam Adams, who was there, was ready for radical action, ready for force. So we have these first essential questions that they had at the Continental Congress. One was how to justify their rights as colonials. So what rights do they even have living in the colonies? And the answer to that one was they looked to laws of nature, they looked to their colonial charters, and they looked to British Constitution, trying to figure out what their rights might be. Gonna have to pause here, and we'll talk about the next two questions. So bear with me, and we'll be back at this shortly.